Hi class, today we're going to be looking at chapter 15, Theories of Evolution. So we're going to go through a few scientists before we get to Darwin, which is the one that probably you're used to or familiar to talking about with evolution. So part one here. If you're in your notes packet, we're just at theories of evolution. So first, a definition of evolution. It is simply a change over time. And so if you put in this whole definition, a heritable change, so something that you can inherit in the characteristics within a population from one generation to the next. This change is not going to happen in that one individual. The one individual can't go, boy, I really wish I was faster, and then they're going to have it. It's going to be something that is an inheritable condition based on the genetics of that organism. So we talked about back in previous chapters that we have the possibility of a dominant or a recessive trait. And in some characteristics, we have codominant traits or multiple allele traits. And so when we're looking at this possibility of difference between organisms, we're looking at which organism has the dominant trait, which organisms have the recessive trait, and which one is better suited for the environment to pass on their traits more often. And that's how we see the change. We see the change based on the genetics that are already available. It's not one organism deciding they were all of a sudden going to be able to do something else. So our ideas that we're going to go through are different scientists all the way up to Darwin, so starting in the 1800s. Our first scientist here, Cuvier, he studied the rock strata, and he found that deeper rocks had extinct life forms, and they were increasingly different as you moved up the rock layers. So his theory that he came up with out of that is catastrophism, where sudden geologic catastrophes caused mass extinctions. Okay, our second scientist leading us up to Darwin is Lyell, and his kind of theory came in with uniformitarianism, and he said the geologic process that shaped the Earth's surface will still occur today. So it's a continual process is what uniformitarianism means, just a continuous uniform type of process is occurring that's causing us to be able to look at these rock layers and see that a rock layer is being laid down, and then there might be organisms that are in that rock layer, and then we see another type of rock layer, and we see that those organisms that are laid down in that particular rock layer. Okay, 3 is Lamarck. And Lamarck is going to be compared to Darwin a lot. So some of our things coming up will compare what Lamarck said to be true with what Darwin said to be true. So in Lamarck, life can arise from non-living matter. Simple life forms change over time. And then his big key thing is inheritance of acquired traits. So if we think about those words, inheritance is just passed on traits. Acquired means that I have worked really hard. I have gained that experience. I have gained that trait or that characteristic, and I'm going to pass that on to my kids. So in this case, it would be, I was really good at football. And since I worked really hard, and I got really good at football, I'm going to pass that trait on or that characteristic on to my offspring. That means my next offspring will be very good at football. And if they work really hard, they're going to even be better. And then that will continue. They'll be able to pass that on to their kids. So the idea here, you acquire traits during your lifetime because you've worked hard, you've gathered things together, you've been good at what you do, and you've practiced something really hard. And so because of that, you pass that on to your future generation. Well, here's some examples of what that would look like. Webbed foot, a stretching of membrane between the toes. So that's kind of like saying ducks can swim now, and they have webbed feet now because in past generations, ducks worked really hard at swimming, and so eventually they got webbed feet. Okay, so this isn't something, at the time, it kind of, there's a lot of parts to it that kind of made sense, but at the same time, when we look at it now, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Another example, long necks, because for giraffes, because they stretched really far to get their food, so the next generation started with longer necks because their parents stretched really far for food. And so eventually we end up with long-necked giraffes because they've all stretched really hard, they worked really hard, so their next generation get whatever their parents worked for. So this will lead us up to Darwin. And he has the theory of natural selection. So his theory states that organisms that are best suited to the environment will make it to reproductive age and will reproduce more often than other organisms. So if you can reproduce more often, you make it to that reproductive age and you reproduce more often, your traits are going to get passed on to the next generation more often than the ones that either don't make it to reproductive age or get eaten or die for some reason before they make it to that age. This leads us to survival of the fittest. And in survival of the fittest, we are saying that if you are more suited to the environment, you are more fit for the environment, you're going to be able to pass on these traits to your offspring. So, Lamarck versus Darwin, and you have a spot in your notes packet with 2 columns. You can compare them. There's 3 main things that we're going to compare as we go through. So the first here, Lamarck would say that early giraffes had short necks and they stretched to reach their food. Darwin would say there were giraffes with different varying heights. So they had some with long necks, some with short necks, some with medium-sized necks. Part 2, Lamarck would say that the offspring of these short-necked giraffes have longer necks because their parents stretched really far. Darwin would say that natural selection led to competition, which allowed for the longer-necked giraffes to survive because they could reach more food. The short-necked giraffes didn't get enough food, and so they died more frequently, meaning that the longer-necked giraffes could make it to reproductive age. They were healthier, they were fitter. They passed on their traits to their offspring. So part 3 here looks at Lamarck saying eventually the giraffes kept stretching their necks and stretching their necks, and eventually the only type of giraffe we had was a long-necked giraffe because their parents stretched their necks really far, and so now our current giraffes don't have to work as hard. They already have long necks. Darwin says eventually we only have long-necked giraffes that survived because of competition. That gene, that trait, is no longer noticed or seen because the ones that are more fit were the long-necked giraffes, and so that's all we see are these long-necked giraffes. Okay, so Darwin, his voyage or his studies were on the HMS Beagle. He published the book on the origin of species, and his goal in that was to present evidence that evolution occurs and explain the distribution of organisms, where they're located around the world, and also the variety that there is around the world. And you can kind of see in these pictures here where his studies took him, and his main studies were on the Galapagos Islands. So there's the Galapagos Islands, picture of that. So Darwin's observations, one of his main things that he studied or showed in this book was with finches. So there's 13 similar but separate species of finches. The main difference between them is their bill or their beak. It was specialized for a certain type of food source. So you can see in the picture here just a couple of the examples. Really thick, wide beaks would maybe be to crack nuts open. And then those little thin beaks would maybe be able to get bugs out of tiny holes in logs or something like that. So there were very many similarities, a lot of similarities. So that would kind of indicate that there was this common ancestor, that they've kind of all developed or evolved from. We see these differences, but there's so many similarities that you would assume that originally there was one type of finch that eventually we see all of these varieties have evolved into. So Darwin's conclusions. We have 4 to put in that space on your notes packet. All species are engaged in a struggle to survive in their changing environment. So everything is trying to survive. They're all competing for food and other resources. Number 2, species change through continual modifications. This is the entire species, not an individual. The individual can change based on what they have available to them in their genetic makeup. But overall, the species and those that are passing their traits on will change based on the genes that are available for the entire gene pool, the entire species themselves. 3, modifications that are best suited for the environment are preserved. So those traits that are the best ones, the ones that allow that individual to survive, will get passed on more often. And then 4, all species descended from one or a few original types of life. And that's our common ancestor idea. And that's the part where you see a little bit more of the controversy in Darwin's theories. Okay, just a few more things here. We'll skip those right now. Modifications by natural selection. So natural selection is how evolution occurs. The environment limits growth of populations. Overproduction is going to cause too much competition and not enough food. So each species produces more offspring than can survive to maturity. And the idea of that is that eventually you're going to see the population kind of level out to a point. It's not going to be able to grow continuously forever and have enough resources for that species to survive. Darwin at the time used work from Thomas Malthus on human overpopulation to show kind of that same idea in nature. Genetic variation. Not all individuals in a population are identical, so the environment will affect individuals differently in that population. Individuals that have favorable traits will reproduce more often and in higher numbers than individuals with unfavorable traits. So an example of adaptation. Adaptations allow an individual to survive in a changing environment. So an adaptation is an inherited trait that increases the chance for that organism to survive in that environment. So some examples here on the owl you can take a look at. But the adaptations allow that individual species, that individual organism to survive in their environment. It's also called adaptive advantage. So any adaptations that are advantageous to that organism will allow them to survive. And then fitness, when we look at that word with Darwin, it's a measurement of the ability of a species to respond to any pressures of natural selection. Pressures would be competition, food resources, shelter resources, etc. And so basically it's the ability of the individual to survive to reproductive age and reproduce, passing on their genes. And this is called survival of the fittest. Okay, that's the end of our introduction to evolution here, and we will get into some more evidence of evolution in our next section.